I think that means I've been given the go-ahead. So I think I'm on the stage. So now I will just share my content. Yes, very good. I'll do second try. Okay, so my name's April Staines. I am a maker. I love making things, and I am going to do a presentation on 3D printing and how it's enabled the growth of individual makers and how that continues to grow. So just to give you a little bit of a background, just a bit about my journey, I consider myself to be a space cadet. I've been 3D printing since 2011. I kind of made my own 3D printer back then. And, you know, I love to create and solve puzzles. It's just the way I am. And tech has enabled me to make things that I never thought were possible. And I get to make all sorts of cool things. I'm the co-founder of Girl Geek Academy, which is an organization set up to increase the number of women in tech. I'm also an additive manufacturing engineer for a aerospace startup. But my day job, unfortunately, is still in the software industry. I'm a principal software engineer for National Australia Bank. That's my current day job. So I sort of do moonlight as a 3D printing person. But also the founder of I guess that you would call it a store, an individual maker called April Storm 3D, and which is running as an Etsy business, and it's been running since 2014 in various ways. So a little bit about the Girl Geek Academy. Our mission is to teach 1 million women technical skills by 2025. This is basically our leadership team. These are all the other co-founders, in one particular area or not. Okay, so where did it all start? Well, obviously, I mean, most of us already know about the evolution of the rep wraps and 3D printers. And when that sort of, for me, when that all started was when they all sort of went open source. I remember the Kickstarter on, I think it was in 2009 for the Thingomatic, the Cupcake CNC 3D printer, which is that kind of wooden box you see here. And that sort of started the whole sort of process. This is one of the printers that I made. It was my first 3D printer. That's the purple one over in the corner there. And really the thing that made this possible was, you know, the democratization of the 3D printing technology becoming really cheap, easy to make. The internet was, you know, and groups and sharing of technology at the same time was happening. And obviously then, you know, this became something that sort of, you know, built upon and snowballed till we end up with people like myself who in 2013 and actually my Etsy store opened in 2014. You know, I started with 4 FDM printers, which I had made myself. They had been printed on other printers and were very primitive by today's standards, but worked quite well. And I started making science fiction props. And you can see some of the props. You can also see Skinny April. I would like to return to Skinny April someday, but you know, I'm right now not so Skinny April thanks to the pandemic. By 2021, I had you know, 6 large FDM printers, which you can see in the background there of this photograph, and for digital light projection printers. And this was my own personal experience, and I was running Etsy store. Just, you know, how that's evolved. So 3D printers are more accessible than ever. I'm cognizant there's some people in here that are in the industry, the professionals, academics. There's a whole bunch of folk out there, but just how cheap and accessible 3D printers have become. It always continues to astound me. I think this is one of the most popular 3D printers, the Creality, Ender 3. It's a very popular printer. I know a lot of people have it, under $200. So really, it's actually a really good printer for what it is, right? It's small, but it's pretty decent. And then, my favorite in the DLP range is the Anycubic range. The prices just keep on coming down and down. This one here is the Photo Mono X, which I bought when it came out for $1,200. It's $300. It's the thing sitting back there. It's kind of annoying, actually. It's so much cheaper now. But what it means is that this technology is very accessible to makers, and particularly people who run their own cottage businesses and their own, our individual makers, often working from home, often making bespoke products, and they use 3D printers as either the final product or it augments the product themselves. Now, how prevalent is this? Well, when I look at individual makers, and this is searching from Australia, which is probably, we don't get anywhere near as much availability from sellers, because you, as a seller on, let's say, and I'm using Etsy as an example here because it's the platform I use and I have the most experience with, but also it has some really good data around it, right? So it's hard to get other data from around craft and individual makers outside of Etsy, simply because there's not one place where you can easily collect this kind of information. So this is just a search. I do a search on Etsy for anything 3D printed. So I just type in 3D printed from Australia. That means they will ship to Australia, which is like probably only a third of them. I get 436,000 results. There's 436,000 things I could buy that are 3D printed that I can, have shipped to my home, right? Now, when I started my store in 2014, I was like that search was very different. I was probably one of a handful of people that were using additive manufacturing, 3D printing to make products. So, and now what's really interesting is that selling the IP, so selling the files so that you can print them yourself, which is pretty much how my business has evolved. Still quite a few, so 52,000 approximately, for STL files that you can download and use to print that you will have to purchase. And that's not, including all the stuff that's on, Thingiverse and everything else that's out there. So kind of examples of things that I have made and others have made. And I'll start with some of the early things that I made. I wanted really to print in metal. Now, I can't print in metal myself. I don't have access to a metal printer, but using bureaus, that actually becomes quite feasible. So if I want to make a product that I want to sell, I just need to model it. This is a conceptual design of a cross between Boba Fett and Hello Kitty that I made into a necklace. And it costs approximately $70 to get shipped from Shapeways. This was Shapeways. It was done actually quite a while ago, 2014. Those prices have changed since, but it gives you an idea. If you want to be able to sell these products, you sell them yourself, or you may augment them with other things. You put a chain on it, or what have you, or maybe part of something else. And there's a couple of cool things, I guess, that we do that I've done. So things like making lamps. So homewares apparently is a growth area. There are a lot of people wanting specialized homewares. So this is a lamp that I 3D printed. I didn't actually design this, someone else did, but this is something that you can, this is actually quite large. I haven't got it in front of me. It's actually in the bedroom, but it's quite a decorative lamp. It's quite fully functional. I also 3D print Halloween props for people, which was sort of an on-demand thing. That is a Nazgul sitting out the front of someone's door. Most of this stuff has been FDM, but in recent times, I have started printing more and more, and other makers have moved to DLP type of printing So things like those Anycubic resin printers, which you can buy for like $300, that will have surprisingly detailed prints, and fairly cheap to run. This is just an example of, I can print this figure, which is actually quite large. It's about, I don't know, I guess it's about 40 centimeters tall, so over a foot tall for those on the old system. And that, as a maker, it's quite rare that you would just sell just the print. You would go then and paint it and do all the additional things to augment that. So then you end up with a statuette, which is quite large and quite detailed, which you can obviously ask for more money when you sell this product. I didn't actually sell this one. It's actually sitting in the entryway of my home because I quite liked it. I kept it myself. The other thing I think to note is that, what I showed before was simply searches for 3D printing products. A lot of the time for cottage type makers, or individual makers, use 3D printing as part of a process, but you don't actually sell the 3D printed product. Example, making molds. I can sell a lot of helmets, and originally I would print basically a mold, and we'll then put silicon over that, and then use that to pour resin into and actually create, an image of that, and use fiberglass and other materials. This is quite common, particularly if you're trying to prototype, and then you want to make more than one copy. It can be quite problematic to get rid of print lines and so on. So this is something that a lot of makers do. And I know a lot of makers who would sell, let's say, Star Wars props, because it's very popular and the sort of thing that I was mainly doing. And they would use this quite a lot. And then obviously, and so on, rather than just having the 3D printed item, you could have something that was actually cast in resin, that was in, basically from a mold, a silicon mold. The other thing, you could do is things like, I would make armor for costumes. Like this is a Mandalorian costume. That's like the body armor that is actually all vac formed. So, and the helmet itself is 3D printed, and some of the other parts are 3D printed. But I guess what this is saying is you can use 3D printing. For example, these are pucks that I use in a thermoforming machine. So a vac former is also known as a vac former, where you heat up a sheet of plastic over a form and you suck the air out, and it takes the shape of that plastic. So these pucks are actually 3D printed. They're then sanded and sort of finished, and it's talcum powder put on top of it so it doesn't get stuck to the sheet of warm plastic. This is an example. This is actually my own personal vac form machine, and I'll put that form in there, and then it will suck the air out, and it kind of looks like this. So this is an example where I am using 3D printing, but I'm not actually selling 3D printed parts. I'm using the 3D printed mold to make this. And that is, the main advantage for this is that I can make many of. And then if you'll start looking at things like sizes, where most people fit between like a small, medium, large kind of size for something, and there's economies of scale if I can make multiple of those, rather than having to print every part of every body armor. For example, a full stormtrooper, I can make it in different sizes, augment that to fit someone, and then vac form it, and then I can also then use that for someone else. So it makes it quite easy to do. So this is an example. So when we speak and we talk about using 3D printing for cottage industry and individual makers, it is not always the case that we are producing the final product as a 3D printed product. It could be we are doing other things. Right, so individual makers and some stats from Etsy's official Q4 full year 2021 results. Now, a lot of people know that, platforms like Etsy really took off during the pandemic, right? And which is obviously very true. And particularly things like, I don't know if you know the story about masks, I think there were like 100,000 Etsy masks being sold within 3 days of those masks mandates going on in the US, or something like that. I can't remember the exact stats. It was just incredible at the agility that individual makers had, particularly when they weren't interrupted with a whole supply chain issues, because they were making these things themselves and sourcing things locally, right? So this is a really interesting statistic. So we've got on the Etsy platform currently we have 96 million active buyers, right? And merchandise sales have increased by 6% this year. So one of the things that I think everyone thought was going to happen was you're going to have this bubble. You're going to have 2020 come, everyone's stuck at home, and they all want to do things. They want on Etsy and buy stuff that they can't get somewhere else. They want to get a personalized mask, and maybe by, I think, was it about 3 months in, everyone decided to start making bread. Right. I'm quoting this from someone else, but I thought it was an interesting story. Everyone decided to make bread. So there was a big demand for yeasts and custom yeast. So you had people who were like, their store businesses closed and they went online and they started selling, bread making utensils and yeasts and all that kind of stuff because there was a big demand for it. And this happened very quickly. Now, the demand could have just as easily gone away very quickly, but it was just a very interesting time to watch that. The thing that's, I guess, more interesting is that has continued into 2021, and this is the last sort of reports that we have. I don't have reports into 2022 or 23, so I don't have those stats to share because Etsy haven't shared them. This is really going from it's a year-old data, but you can imagine that there was an expectation that would drop off as we started to open up. We went back to business as usual. That would drop off. That is not the case. Etsy has kept on growing, and the market has kept on growing. Indeed, the individual maker market has continued to grow at about the same rate, which is amazing. So the Etsy sellers contributed to 14.3 billion over 3 million jobs to the US independent worker economy. So that's just US. Now Etsy is global, so there haven't released the statistics for individual domain regions, but very, very interesting. And what's really interesting to me is that 71% of Etsy sellers think it's critical to expand responsibly and sustainably. So about a quarter of all international sellers have decided to join over 10,000 Etsy teams. Now, one of these teams, they're all sorts of different teams, but they're things like the ways that and offer support and opportunities to collaborate. So if I'm a maker of like a part, let's say buttons, I could sell my buttons that I've made locally to people who make dresses, right? Or shirts or something like that. And that's the sort of thing that Etsy, the platform, allowed, is that sort of collaboration. So there's like forums and so on, and there may be other makers on in here who've used that platform. Obviously that comes with fees, right? The platform itself takes fees, but it's interesting. And obviously the customers themselves are looking at increasingly more bespoke and unique items that are not just mass produced. And I think one of the things that is unique about this particular platform, and I'm sure there'll be others, was that you've got this kind of rating system where you've got maybe a small maker. There's no way of knowing whether you're going to get that product or it's going to be any good. And because your customers review the products and they're encouraged strongly to review them, you get this sort of feedback loop, and people like that, right? So the platform's been growing quite a lot. So this is just some visualization of the growth, and you can see when the pandemic hit, there was a big surge. Now there's quite a lot of masks in that 10 that's in millions, by the way. The 10,000 million figure here. So, the growth continues to go. So I would expect some leveling up in 2022, but, everything so far is pointing that has continued to go. There's a desire for authenticity, and one of the things I guess that's really interesting is the agility of sellers that you don't get with traditional supply chain. I can, within days, you could be going from selling one product to something else because you don't really, everything's kind of made on demand, and you don't have the same sort of restrictions that you have with big manufacturers. So during this is a statistic, here it is, 10,000 people who within 2 or 3 days started making masks to help present the spread of COVID-19. So you had 10,000 sellers selling masks within 2 or 3 days, which is amazing, really. It's kind of a never before seen thing. Another thing that I find really interesting is just some of the other statistics around it is most of the individual makers run their shops from homes, from their home, which I did. I had a garage and I basically had no cars in the garage. It was all just 3D printers and various other equipment. Most of them aspire to increase sales. So it's not just a fleeting thing that we're doing. 79% are female. It's very interesting when you think about it. And they consider their shop to be a business. It's not just a hobby, right? They say they say that their income has held steady, if not grown, since the pandemic. And that's exactly what I found. I actually found it got unmanageable, to be completely honest. And they started their Etsy shop as a way to supplement income. Now, I did the same thing, but it was kind of a supply-demand thing. And then I have evolved my business just because of it. And they consider it important to be socially responsible. There are multi-channel sellers that they sell from vertical markets and so on. I used to sell through a couple of verticals, particularly around the prop and industry. And 32% are pursuing the business as their sole occupation, which means they've got other jobs like me, right? So there's actually quite a large percentage that also have other work. Right. So another thing I guess I'm going to sort of talk about just briefly is this whole thing about the gig economy, right? Because when you talk about Etsy, they go, it's like a platform like Airtasker and everything else. Well, yes and no, right? So I think the gig economy is massive. And I think the growth of the gig economy is again, if you look at, the statistics from the US, an independent workforce. Now, whether this pertains to Australia, I'm not entirely sure, but this is just interesting stats. And when we talk about that, we're talking about things like, Uber driving to Airtaskers and all that kind of stuff, which make up the larger percentage, right? The individual makers, particularly the ones on the Etsy platform, are a very small slice of that, if you want to put them into that bucket, which I debate whether they are, you would call it the gig economy, because a gig to me is something you kind of just do and then walk away from. Whereas makers tend to be much more passionate, particularly if you're designing, and you're sharing that creativity with others. It's not something that you can just flip on and flip off. It's something that you would want to develop a reputation. I myself had a reputation for producing Mandalorian costumes, so much so that I would, the design, because I couldn't keep up with demand, I ended up selling the files, the IP, so people could print them themselves, used to always be on the front page of the search if you search for Mandalorian helmet. Now, that has since changed, which is fine by me because, my lifestyle kind of has changed as well. I don't quite have the free time I used to have to be able to do this. So that's fine. But it was one of those things where it was, incredibly, interesting. So summing it all up, individual makers, definitely, 3D printing is something that has augmented the industry. It's something that we are, it will continue to evolve as far as I can see and continue to expand. How much so, I don't know. So that's really it for my kind of presentation. I am happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, April, for this insightful presentation. I mean, I must say, you are a real woman in business when it comes to 3D printing. And we have, a couple of questions with us from our participants. I would be happy to, have you all answered. So the first question is, how do you balance an open source philosophy with the need to make money as well, since it's very common in the makers movement, everything is kind of open source? So how do you kind of balance it out? That's the question.
So typically, and one of the, I'll use my helmet for an example. So I have a 3D printable helmet that has fans for cooling built into the design, so you can insert the fans. I openly share that design for free, but it's slightly lower polygon, so it's a little bit more work to finish, and it doesn't have the fans. Right? So I have a version that is the free version, and then I have like the pro version,
that's
which
really
you can
smart.
buy.
Yes,
right?
that's a
And
smart
that way
move.
I'm still keeping that. People can go and enhance that model, and I make that open source, and they can print it and they can sell it and do all those things. But the pro version I have. So if you want the ones with the fans and things and just a little bit of extra, then you have to give me some money for it. At least that's how I started. Now, I've kind of got to the point now where I don't care anymore. I'm going to give it all away and make it all open source. But it's, with those sort of things, I also had my own philosophy that I would keep a version of something current as my own, and I would make the previous version, so an older version, open source. So others can just copy it, and you can do whatever you want with it.
Wow, that's so lovely.
And I found that actually helped my business because it all love backs. Like, people love free stuff, right? And what that did is it drove the popularity of the models up much more than anything I would have made by keeping those things to myself. I actually think keeping things to yourself is the dumbest thing you can do, especially in the prop thing.
Yes, yes.
Because it just, and most of this really cool stuff is stuff that you share and you work, and other people then contribute to it, and it's fantastic to see what happens with that.
We will just quickly take one more question. I will just merge two questions in one question. So what have been the best ways to market your business? Just to get out a message out there that you do exist. And how was the community support? What kind of support did you get from your own community? So that's the question.
So I think sort of partially answered it previously. Making things free and giving stuff to the community will in itself help you, right? Particularly if it's something that is unique, particularly something other people want. And if you make it if you have like a free version, that will self-perpetuate because people love free shit. And you go and stick stuff on Thingiverse, and then you put it in the Thingiverse. You have the link to, if you would like the one that comes with instructions, come here. The other thing, I wouldn't put the instructions in the free stuff. You just had to figure it out. And particularly with some of the bigger, more complicated props, like I've got, I don't do, this isn't mine, but it's you can imagine I have I don't know if you can see the R2-D2 in the background, but R2-D2 is very complicated. Now that's open source, right? And that has been added to the community. I don't sell this. This isn't my model, but that is something that's very cool and very popular. And if you had something like that, which you made and then you shared, and it can't just be token, it's got to be something that has some actual value. You need to be willing to make that sacrifice. There's a potential that you will get the kudos for that, and it will self-perpetuate, and you will get the free marketing because people will organically recommend you, particularly if it's in like a forum or a group. Interest groups are the ones to try and tap into, if you can, if you've got a market for it.
I so agree with you. So much, April, for your presentation. We all thank